Welcome to SmallTalk by Sfarim Chatter. I'm Nachi Weinstein. On this episode of SmallTalk, I'm going to be joined by Rabbi Gavriel Singer, who is the author of the newly published book, Foundations and Concepts in Lomdus, 21 Essential Principles of Lomdus for Clear Understanding of the Gemara, published by Mosaic Press. So thank you, Rabbi Singer, for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
What can you tell the listeners about this new book?
Okay, so this new book is really trying to do something that I think hasn't been done in the past. There's a lot of interest nowadays in learning Gemara. There's a lot of Gemara Shirim, Eli Stefensky. The people are really reaching out and trying to engage in learning Gemara in a way that we haven't seen in the past, that it's reached the masses. At the same time, there's a certain lack of depth of understanding that, a person who's been in yeshiva his whole life was privy to gain through his experience and through his years that he spent learning. So your newcomer to the scene isn't really able to access the Gemara the same way, and you have very bright, intellectual, engaged individuals that want to grow in their learning, but they're lacking the tools to be able to do so. So what I did is I wrote a sefer in English that really elucidates some of the core principles to give them a clear understanding and the ability to really engage the Gemara on a different level they would be able to without it.
Right, and therefore you did it in English. I think something that comes to mind, especially from my days, Yeshiva Bacher, was, you said this, v'chakiris, there's such a thing in Hebrew, big sefer, but this is really, I think, like you're saying, the first attempt to really create such a thing in English.
Yeah, for sure. And even like a sefer like Kovetz Yesodus v'chakiros, really what it is very good at giving you sources. But it doesn't take the time to go ahead and try to explain what each source is, how to develop its stance, and really compare and contrast the different opinions in any given matter. So here it's really more than just an encyclopedia of giving you where to look, but it's actually showing you the development and really trying to develop the different stances and ideas and concepts which are being expressed by the different Rishonim Achronim.
Okay, I think we should jump in and go through and clarify the structure of the sefer and some examples. That way listeners can understand. I'll mention, we mentioned there are 21 principles. So I'll mention some of them. Really, I can just mention all of them, and then you can pick an example and try to explain like how a chapter works. So you have one is Einis, and each one you write the in Hebrew, and then you write it in English. So you have Einis, Kimle B'Derabamine, Yarek Val Yavar, Edim Zoymamin, Chatzi Shir, Davar She'enim Miskavin, Roiv, Chazakis, Migu, Svek Sveka, Mitzvah Shichas Kavana, Hidur Mitzvah, Oizik Mitzvah, Potter Mena Mitzvah, Ein Oisin Mitzvahs, Chavilois, Mitzvah Baba Avera, Aseit Techalois Asei, Shmei Akaina, Tech Tedibur, Dvarim Shebelev, Einem Dvarim, Davar Shalei Bel Olam, Hefker Bez and Hefker. So real kind of classics, if you will, and then we'll discuss later. You also have components of the oral Torah, biographical information for quoted sources, and glossary, and we'll get into the biography stuff soon. So you can pick one or two examples you want to run through to explain to the listener. They can feel for the sefer, and also the structure of that particular example you'll give to explain like how does a chapter here in this book work.
Okay, for sure, 100%. So I'll give you a good classic example of a topic that can be used, that's used throughout Shas, and really having a depth in its understanding will, enlighten you and really give you a better ability to engage in your learning is let's take Rov, for example. Rov is that you follow the majority. So in the chapter of Rov, first off, we start and say, when does Rov apply? Any time that I want to go ahead and determine something, I can just pull out a Rov. A Rov means follow the majority. So first of all, we clarify that Rov always applies whenever you have a doubt. Anytime there's a given doubt in a scenario, so halacha also has different tools to utilize in order to engage any given doubt and know what the proper thing to do is. So one of the tools is Rov, that you follow the majority. So the first thing I do is I'll show you the source in the Chumash. The source in the Chumash for Rov is Achrei Rab Nahatos, that we know from Beis Din, that Beis Din you follow the majority of opinion in Beis Din. Rashi says there's two different types of Rov. There's something called a Ruba de Isa Kaman. That's a Rov with the different variables that, make up the majority, that we have those variables in front of us. We have, definable variables. And there's something called the Ruba de Lesa Kaman, where there's a Rov, there's a majority that's an assumed majority. There's a nature of the world. We assume that the majority of animals that are alive, they're kosher. And therefore you could drink milk from an animal because we assume that the animal is kosher, even though we didn't check it. So Rashi, I'll bring you a Rashi that says that when it comes to Ruba de Isa Kaman, when we have known variables, that we learn from a pasuk, But Aruba de Lesa Kamon, that we don't know from a pasuk maybe. Maybe that's only halacha l'Moshe Sinai. That's something which we have an oral tradition that it's true, and so true on a deraisa level. Or, no, maybe it's also learned from Achrei Ram Nahatos. Maybe it's the same pasuk, because why not? What's the difference? In order to go ahead now and engage that Rashi, I brought 4 different achronim that give different explanations of what's the mechanism through which Aruba de Isa Kaman works. How is it that this rove, we able to follow the majority and that is able to determine halacha? And there I brought a Sridei Eish, a Shara Yosher, a Remea Simcha, and a Kobet Shiurim. And these are all classic svarim that, a basic achronim that in the yeshivas people learn. And then I'll bring the concept of Ruba de Lesa Kaman, and we'll describe what's the function, what's the mechanism through which Ruba de Lesa Kaman works out. And then I brought you a Shara Yosha and a different Rabbi Chanan. And now, based off of that, we'll come and explain that these different interpretations can actually result in how Rashi goes ahead and addresses that distinction. How could it be that there's 2 different approaches, whether or not Ruba de Lesa Kaman is based in a pasuk, it's not based in a pasuk. So it depends on how you understand the mechanism of what a Ruba de Lesa Kaman is and how that functions. And really, so what we're trying to do is showing through that the different approaches to how to understand the concept that the Gemara itself is utilizing can result in different interpretations in the Rishonim and the Achronim. And then that can be applied. So if that's how rove functions, there's an unbelievable idea. You can use a rove in capital court cases, but you can't use a rove in monetary cases. So why would that be? Seemingly, if you can use it for capital cases, monetary cases should also be able to use rove. That would be one example of how we do use it. And each time that we bring up a different concept, a different rishon, a different achron, and try to develop it, we're going to try not just to explain to you what's being said, but why that which is being said makes a difference in a practical sense, and bring you different cases and scenarios how to see that application.
A couple things to point out. Let's take the specific chapter of Roiv. So the footnotes are in Hebrew, and you quote the sources. So the Sefer is elucidating the sugya of Roiv, for example, and this concept in Lomdus in English, but the footnotes for further depth are in Hebrew. Additionally, you have this very interesting feature of these biographical detail. I think we should kind of discuss it, like indented in the page in like a lighter ink, a lighter font. You have on, let's say, here you have one page that you have on Rashi, which is interesting because he does in Rashi. You mentioned Rashi a little biography. I'll read the other one. You mentioned the Shimon Shkop, Shar Yosher. So you have, it sounds like this. It's a small paragraph. I'll just read it. Rabbi Shimon Yehuda Kohen Shkop was born in Lithuania. He studied in the yeshivas of Mir and Brisk and was a primary student of Rabbi Chaim Brisker. He taught in multiple yeshivas and eventually became the Yeshiva of Grodno. Rabbi Shkop developed a unique form of Talmudic analysis, which he applied in his teachings. He published a commentary on the Talmud Bavli and a work entitled Shara Yosher, after which he is widely known. This work offers deep and profound analysis of various Talmudic concepts. He lived from 1860 to 1939. And this is done throughout the Sefer, sprinkled throughout, so you get some little history tidbits and some biographical analysis throughout the Sefer and discussing the various Torah personalities that we encounter. Why did you decide to include these?
So that's a great question. I teach in yeshiva, and we get boys who are coming for a year or two right after high school. And a lot of times I find that when they're learning Gemara, they'll think that, Rabbi Chanan Wasserman can disagree with the Rambam. And Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, lived until the mid-1940s. And the Rambam, passed away 800, 900 years before him. So therefore, obviously the two never had an argument. So I think in one hand, it's valuable just any time someone's going ahead and engaging in a type of, analysis and learning. First of all, he should understand who the players are. How do they interact with each other? Rabbi Chanan, because he comes so much later, is never going to argue with the Rambam. He's only going to come ahead and try to explain, differences between Rambam and Rashi, explain where the Rambam's coming from. That's number one. Number two, I also want that a person who's learning feels connected to his learning. And a lot of times, a person, to feel connected to the learning, has to have, in a certain way, an emotional connection, not just an intellectual connection. And as much as we know, who different political players are, we know how much our different sports figures are, if you don't have any kind of connection, who's Reb Shimon, and how did Reb Shimon come from Reb Chaim, and his Derech HaLimud seems so much different. That also, in a certain way, makes you more connected to the Sefer, and it makes you more connected to the learning itself. So I thought that was an important aspect to add to when we're giving fundamentals into learning, to try to give them that emotional connection as well.
the end of each chapter also has a summary. So you go through a quick summary, a synopsis of the main points. So, like as you mentioned in the chapter on Roiv, so you'll have 4 approaches to Ruba the Lesikam, and you start going through that. You have a bullet point, 3 Yesh. You mentioned we discussed Shari Yesher, Ramir Simcha, Kavitz Yurim, and then you go through and you break down the Rebbe a little more. Like it's a real nice breakdown, very clear and easy explained. Now, I mentioned before the Hebrew, I want to mention that you a lot of times quote verbatim the sources. So it's not just like you're mentioning, oh, look here, no, you quote it so people can read obviously not going to quote the whole shtickle of the Shariah, but you're quoting a nice chunk that people can read and get a feel of what's going on. One thing I want to ask you about the sources, we've mentioned here an example, some of the ones that you discuss. Is it generally like a who's who of Rashi Yeshivas and the classical Lomdus Svarim, or do you also go through earlier Svarim like Pnei Yeshua or others, for example?
So that's a great question. The truth be told, I really try to make it as diverse as possible. So we for sure have a who's who of Rosh Yeshivas, but I also quote from a big variety of Rishonim, and also a lot from the early Achronim as well. So, like the Shagas Arya, we quote a lot from the Chacham Tzvi, the Machane Ephraim, as well as, the Ktsosa Choshen and Nesivus HaMishpat. It varies from the whole span of development of the Gemara, and it's trying to give a holistic sense of development of each of these concepts. So it's not just we have the Gemara and then we have a Rishon and then we have the Rosh Hashiva, but really we can see that process being developed throughout.
What's nice in the back is that you have a glossary of terms, and I'm sure listeners are familiar with the glossary. It's just, kind of a list of terms and their quick definitions. But I think in this sefer it's very interesting because if you're gearing this, and we're going to talk in a minute about who this sefer is geared towards, I think it's nice that you put a glossary of terms people can just flip to and say, okay, what does that term mean?
Yeah, for sure.
Now, who would you say the sefer is meant for?
So that's a question I asked myself, throughout the process of writing this, and I think that really it addresses a wide range of audience. I guess the most basic audience is the audience I described already. That is the person who really wants to engage in learning and wants to grow in his understanding of his learning, but wasn't brought up or doesn't yet have the skills to go ahead and really do that on his own. So this is giving you really a good proficiency in background knowledge in any given topic that you can take with you and keep in your back pocket for whenever you engage it in the future. But really, it speaks to the Talmud Chacham, meaning as much as, all of us, we sat and learned in yeshiva and we spent time learning, to have concepts and principles which are clear and without any kind of yeshivish terms that we kind of get lost in the real meaning of what the Achron is trying to say, and just have a clear, organized presentation of difficult concepts, especially with the fact that the sources are there with you on the page. I think as an educational tool, and even just for someone's own personal learning, I think is a priceless, asset to have as a reference.
A similar related question is, what are you trying to accomplish with this book?
Really what I'm trying to accomplish is I'm trying to make the learning in depth something which is accessible to more people and also to be appreciated. What's going into it. The people make the joke, the guy sitting there stroking his beard and he's been there for 2 days straight and he learned 2 lines of Gemara. So what is that? How could that be? He fell asleep? And the answer is no. There's such a depth here that every word, every nuance in a Rashi, every nuance in the Gemara is really, there's a depth to it that is accessible, and that's something which you can, even see and share with someone else. So that's really, I think, what I'm trying to offer, is that this is something which is trying to make it accessible to anyone.
Okay. I'll link to the book in the show notes. And as with all Mosaica books, you can use code CHATTER, CHATTER, for 15% off. And I should mention, I don't think I mentioned, it's with 350 plus pages, so it's a pretty nice size sefer going through, as we mentioned, 21 different topics. So thank you, Rabbi Singer, for joining me to discuss your new sefer.
All right, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to share.